The outbreak of World War I and the resulting disruption of communication between Europe and the United States dramatically shifted the global fashion landscape. With Paris isolated, New York seized the opportunity to emerge as a new leader in design, pioneering styles that blended practicality with a fresh sense of femininity. As men marched off to the front, women stepped into roles they had never held before. They took over jobs in munitions factories and administrative offices and served as drivers and nurses. They volunteered for organizations like the Red Cross and even joined the military. This new era of self-reliance and freedom led them to abandon traditional gender roles, sparking a widespread demand for the right to vote. These new occupations required a change in attire. Many women were required to wear uniforms, which sometimes included trousers, a previously unheard-of garment for women in public life. The military's aesthetic also seeped into civilian fashion, inspiring designs with features like tunic jackets, belts, and epaulettes. As the world entered a period of wartime austerity, the lavish, opulent clothing of the Edwardian era fell out of favor. Women began to wear less jewelry and embraced a much plainer lifestyle. Driven by new roles and a desire for comfort, traditional dress codes for women became more relaxed. Skirts became shorter, as they often do during wartime, and the color palette grew more sober and muted. This functional, no-frills style became a physical representation of the strength and self-respect women were earning through their crucial contributions to the war effort. During World War I, French women's fashion underwent a transformation that was unique among the warring nations. As the global capital of fashion, Paris had to reconcile its status as a leader in haute couture with the grim realities of total war. The result was a remarkable blend of practicality, patriotism, and an artistic resilience that saw French designers turn wartime limitations into a source of revolutionary new styles. Unlike the fashion industries in Germany or Russia, which were crippled by the war, French haute couture never completely shut down. Instead, it adapted. Designers like Coco Chanel and Jean Patou led the way, streamlining their designs to be both elegant and functional. They created simpler, more modern garments that used less fabric, which was crucial during a time of rationing. They also realized that fashion could be a vital source of revenue, producing shorter, simplified dresses for export to countries like the United States to keep the national economy afloat. This strategic move ensured that Paris remained the center of the fashion world even as the war raged. The most significant shift was the move away from the restrictive silhouettes of the pre-war Edwardian era. The war demanded that women be able to move and work freely, and their clothing reflected this. The end of the corset. The war effectively killed the corset, with women entering factories, working on farms, and driving ambulances. The constricting, stiffly boned garment became impractical and was abandoned in favor of more comfortable lingerie. Goodbye to the hobble skirt. Designs that restricted movement, such as the pre-war hobble skirt, which was so narrow at the hem that it prevented women from taking a full stride, disappeared entirely. In their place came much simpler, wider-hemmed skirts that allowed for freedom of movement. The new silhouette, the garçon look, characterized by a straighter, more boyish silhouette, emerged. Dresses became narrower and shorter, with hemlines rising to mid-calf to conserve fabric and make walking easier. Women volunteering for auxiliary services also adopted new, practical clothing. Organizations like the Union des Femmes de France and the Croix-Rouge Française, French Red Cross, issued their female members simple, utilitarian uniforms that prioritized function. This move toward standardized functional dress mirrored the broader shift in civilian fashion.
In essence, women's clothing in France during World War I was a remarkable story of resilience and adaptation. It demonstrated how, even in the face of immense hardship, a nation's core identity and artistic spirit could not only survive, but also flourish, paving the way for the liberated styles of the Roaring Twenties.
During World War I, women's fashion in Russia underwent a dramatic transformation, driven by a blend of wartime necessity, profound social upheaval, and the unique circumstances of the Eastern Front. Unlike their Western counterparts, Russian women's clothing reflected not only a shift toward practicality, but also their unprecedented participation in combat and a society on the verge of revolution. With millions of men conscripted, women across Russia, from urban factory workers to rural peasants, stepped into physically demanding roles. Their clothing had to adapt for work that was often heavy and outdoors. Women entering factories and public services for the first time abandoned the traditional, multi-layered clothing of the past. Their new attire was purely functional, consisting of simple blouses and long skirts, or, more radically, overalls and trousers for dangerous jobs in munitions and metalworking. This marked a profound departure from pre-war norms, where pants were exclusively menswear. Women entering factories and public services for the first time abandoned the traditional, multi-layered clothing of the past. Their new attire was purely functional, consisting of simple blouses and long skirts, or more radically, overalls and trousers for dangerous jobs in munitions and metalworking. This marked a profound departure from pre-war norms, where pants were exclusively menswear. In rural areas, where women became the primary agricultural workforce, they continued to wear simplified versions of traditional peasant clothing. Layers were reduced for practicality, and materials were limited to what was available. This shift from a domestic role to the sole provider of farm labor was a visible testament to their new responsibility. The uniforms worn by women in service were perhaps the most symbolic of their changing status, directly reflecting their proximity to the front lines and the radical nature of their roles. Russian nurses, known as Sisters of Mercy, wore a standard uniform, typically a long woolen dress or skirt with a blouse and a headscarf. However, due to the highly mobile nature of the Eastern Front, official regulations restricting women from combat zones were impossible to enforce. Nurses often worked in forward positions, forcing them to adapt their impractical uniforms. They frequently exchanged their dresses and veils for men's military boots, leather jackets, and even trousers to navigate the mud, cold, and unpredictable terrain. The most striking example of clothing as a symbol of change was the uniform of the Women's Combat Battalions formed in 1917. The female soldiers, under the command of figures like Maria Boshkareva, were required to shave their heads and wear standard men's military uniforms. This was a deliberate act meant to eliminate any sense of femininity and demonstrate their dedication to their nation. The sight of these uniformed, shaven-headed women was a shocking and powerful visual that highlighted a complete break from traditional gender roles. For women who did not participate in the war effort in an official capacity, fashion still reflected the somber mood of the nation and the reality of widespread austerity. Simplicity and restraint. The pre-war opulence of the Russian aristocracy gave way to a simpler, more restrained aesthetic. Elaborate gowns, rich fabrics, and excessive jewelry were largely abandoned.
This shift was partly due to material shortages and a patriotic desire to avoid frivolous displays of wealth during wartime.
Many civilian women adopted elements of the new, practical styles seen on the streets and in public transport. Straight-line silhouettes, shorter skirts, and muted colors became the norm, creating a more uniform appearance across social classes than ever before. This subtle but significant change reflected a collapsing social hierarchy and a move toward a more egalitarian, albeit wartime, society.
In summary, the clothing of Russian women during WW1 was a powerful visual record of a society in flux. It moved from the ornate and traditional to the utilitarian and revolutionary, reflecting their vital roles as laborers, caregivers, and for the first time on a large scale, soldiers, all of which directly contributed to the dramatic social and political changes that would follow. During World War I, the clothing worn by women in Germany was shaped by a unique set of circumstances that made their experience distinct from that of other nations: a comprehensive Allied naval blockade. While women in other countries saw their fashion evolve out of new professional roles, German women's attire was primarily defined by severe scarcity and a national policy of total war. From the earliest days of the war, the British naval blockade severely restricted Germany's access to vital imports, including raw materials for textiles. Supplies of cotton, silk, jute, and even quality wool dwindled. This forced the German government to implement strict rationing and to promote the use of ersatz materials, substitutes. Women's clothing began to be made from a mix of natural and artificial fibers, including paper threads, processed nettle fiber, and repurposed fabrics. This resulted in garments that were coarse, less durable, and prone to shrinking or falling apart. The concept of Kriegswirtschaft, or a war economy, dictated that every resource, including clothing, must serve the state's needs. Lavish pre-war designs and the elaborate layering of the Edwardian era became a symbol of extravagance and unpatriotic behavior. Clothing was stripped down to its most basic functional form. Women's dresses and blouses became simple, street-cut, and unadorned. Pleats, ruffles, and decorative stitching were seen as a waste of precious fabric and were eliminated from designs. The vibrant colors and bold patterns of pre-war fashion disappeared. Dyes were expensive and in short supply, so most fabrics were left in their natural, often drab colors, or dyed using basic, muted shades of gray, brown, and blue. Like women in other nations, German women entered male-dominated jobs in factories and on farms. Their work clothes were purely utilitarian, prioritizing durability and ease of movement over style. These were often simple, dark-colored smocks or overalls. The scarcity of materials highlighted the growing divide between the classes. While the working class and rural women wore clothing made from basic, homegrown materials or flimsy substitutes, the wealthy still managed to acquire higher quality fabrics through a burgeoning black market. For the average German woman, the focus was on mending and patching old clothes. Old garments were often unstitched and remade into new items, a practice that became a necessity for survival rather than a choice.
Despite the hardships, the war did bring one liberating change. The need for practicality and the lack of resources effectively killed off the corset. Without the means to produce or afford these restrictive garments, women were freed from their physical constraints. This involuntary liberation paved the way for the more natural, unrestrained silhouettes that would become popular across the Western world in the 1920s.
In summary, German women's fashion during World War I was a raw reflection of the nation's struggle. It was a story told not through new styles or bold statements, but through a radical and forced move toward simplicity, resourcefulness, and austerity, making their clothing a powerful visual symbol of the immense pressure and hardship on the home front. During World War I, women's fashion in Britain underwent a dramatic transformation, acting as a visual testament to their shifting roles and the nation's collective spirit. Unlike the fashion of other warring nations, which was defined by either severe scarcity or high-fashion innovation, British women's clothing was characterized by a powerful blend of practicality, military-inspired style, and patriotic austerity. As hundreds of thousands of British women entered the workforce to replace men at the front, their clothing had to adapt to new, physically demanding jobs. This led to the widespread adoption of uniforms and workwear, which represented the most significant fashion shift of the era. Women joined new auxiliary forces, like the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, WAAC, the Women's Royal Naval Service, WRNS, and the Women's Royal Air Force, WRAF. They were issued practical, military-style uniforms, typically consisting of khaki or navy jackets and skirts, accompanied by sturdy boots and caps. The members of the WLA, affectionately known as the Land Girls, took on agricultural labor. Their uniform, designed for outdoor work, often included practical shirts, jackets, and most notably, breeches or trousers, a revolutionary and public departure from the traditional dress code for women. Women working in munitions factories wore simple, dark-colored smocks or overalls to protect their clothes and prevent them from being caught in machinery. This functional attire became an iconic symbol of the vital home front effort. Even for women not in uniform, the war influenced everyday dress. The need to conserve resources and a prevailing sense of national solidarity led to the abandonment of pre-war opulence. Clothing became simpler and less restrictive. The elaborate draping, ruffles, and heavy layering of the Edwardian era were gone. Skirts became shorter, often rising to the ankle, both to save fabric and to allow for easier movement on crowded public transport. The war effectively put an end to the rigid, steel-boned corset. The new active lifestyles of women in the workforce and the scarcity of materials made the garment impractical. This marked a major step towards the more natural, freer silhouette that would dominate the 1920s. The bright, varied color palettes of pre-war fashion were replaced by muted, sober tones like navy, gray, brown, and khaki. This was partly due to dye shortages and also a reflection of the somber, serious atmosphere of wartime. A uniquely British aspect of this fashion change was the influence of the monarchy. Queen Mary became a powerful fashion icon of the home front, promoting austerity and resourcefulness through her own dress. She publicly wore simpler, more conservative outfits, encouraging the public to mend and repurpose old clothes rather than buying new ones. This act of patriotic frugality set a strong example and helped shape public sentiment. In essence, women's clothing in Britain during World War I was far more than just attire. It was a visual representation of their newfound independence, a testament to their crucial role in the war effort, and a powerful symbol of national unity and resilience.
During World War I, the clothing of women in the Austro-Hungarian Empire was a direct reflection of the immense economic hardship and political decay that plagued the nation. While women in other countries saw their fashion evolve out of new professional freedoms, the styles in Austria-Hungary were defined by a profound, enforced practicality born of scarcity.
The dual monarchy faced a brutal Allied naval blockade, which choked off its supply lines for essential materials like cotton, silk, and rubber. This led to severe rationing and a reliance on low-quality ersatz materials, substitutes. Women's garments were often made from paper threads, spun nettle fibers, or repurposed fabrics. These materials were not only uncomfortable and fragile, but also difficult to dye, resulting in a somber and muted color palette of grays, browns, and dull blues. Like women in other warring nations, Austro-Hungarian women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, taking over jobs in factories, public transport, and agriculture. Women volunteering for medical services or relief work wore simple, practical uniforms. These were designed for function over form, with little to no embellishment. The uniform of the nurses, for example, was a plain white or gray dress with an apron and headdress, prioritizing hygiene and utility.
For those working in munitions and industrial plants, clothing was purely utilitarian. They wore simple blouses and dark, durable skirts or trousers to protect their bodies from machinery and dirt. The uniform itself became a symbol of their vital contribution to the war effort. The shortages had a dramatic effect on civilian fashion. The elaborate folkloric styles and fine fabrics that once characterized the diverse regions of the empire were entirely abandoned.
Fashion magazines and designers, under state direction, promoted a lifestyle of austerity. The emphasis was on simplicity, durability, and a patriotic duty to conserve. Skirts were shortened to save fabric, and decorative pleats and ruffles were eliminated. Women were encouraged to mend and repair old garments, and families would often unpick old clothes to reuse the thread for new items.
The inability to buy new clothes led to an ingenious make-do aesthetic. Women became masters of creative repurposing, turning old curtains into dresses or patching together different fabrics to create new pieces. This style, born of necessity, gave a unique, patched-together look to civilian attire.
In summary, the clothing of women in Austria-Hungary during World War I was a powerful visual record of an empire in decline. It was not a story of liberation or bold new style, but of resilience in the face of immense scarcity. The somber, unadorned, and often patched-together garments became a poignant symbol of the collective sacrifice and suffering on the home front.
During World War I, the clothing worn by women in the Ottoman Empire was a complex tapestry of tradition, burgeoning westernization, and the harsh realities of wartime. Unlike the more unified national styles seen in Europe, Ottoman fashion was deeply influenced by the empire's diverse population, its own unique economic challenges, and the ongoing social reforms. The Ottoman Empire's involvement in the war and the subsequent Allied blockade severed its access to European goods, including imported fabrics, dyes, and ready-made clothing. This created a severe scarcity that forced a shift from luxurious, colorful fabrics to simpler, often locally produced materials. Garments became less ornate, with a focus on durability and utility over opulence. This meant a move away from silk and intricate embroidery towards more basic wool and cotton, often in muted, natural tones. Traditional Ottoman women's attire consisted of several layers, including baggy trousers, shalvar, a chemise, gumlek, and an outer robe, antari.
For public spaces, women wore the farache, a long cloak, or the charshaf, a veil. During the war, these traditional garments were adapted to a more practical style. While the core elements of modest dress remained, the garments themselves became simpler. The faraje, for example, was streamlined, losing its decorative details and becoming a basic, functional overcoat suitable for a society increasingly on the move.
With men on the front lines, Ottoman women took on new roles that required specific, practical clothing. While not as widespread as in Western nations, women's participation in the war effort was a significant social development. Women volunteering for the Ottoman Red Crescent Society, Hilal-i-Ahmer, and other aid organizations played a vital role. Their uniforms were a blend of traditional modesty and modern practicality. They typically consisted of a simple, long-sleeved dress, a head covering, and an armband with the Red Crescent emblem. This uniform legitimized their public presence and was seen as a socially acceptable form of service. As women entered the civilian workforce as secretaries, clerks, and even street sweepers, their clothing had to be comfortable and modest. A simple dress with a cape or jacket became a common uniform for women in these public-facing roles, a practical alternative to the more elaborate pre-war ensembles. The pre-war trend of westernization, particularly among the urban elite, did not stop, but was significantly altered by the war. Fashion magazines and imported clothes from Europe were no longer available, so Ottoman women adapted.
Instead of full-blown Western styles, they blended European elements like straight-line silhouettes and simpler tailoring with traditional Ottoman garments, creating a unique aesthetic that was both modern and culturally rooted. The arrival of Russian refugees in Istanbul after the Bolshevik Revolution also brought new fashion influences, such as colorful scarves and different ways of tying head coverings.
In summary, the clothing of women in the Ottoman Empire during World War I was a complex visual representation of a society caught between a long history of tradition and the forces of modernization and war. Their fashion was defined by a shift from opulence to austerity and from a traditional, layered aesthetic to a more streamlined, functional one that reflected their vital, evolving roles in a nation undergoing a profound and irreversible transformation.
During World War I, American women's fashion underwent a significant transformation that was distinct from the experiences of their European counterparts. Because the United States entered the war late, 1917, and was not subjected to the severe naval blockades that crippled European economies, the changes in American fashion were driven less by material scarcity and more by a powerful mix of patriotism, practicality, and the rise of a uniquely American identity. Before the war, Paris reigned as the undisputed center of the fashion world, with American designers and stores simply copying French designs. However, the war's severed communication and supply lines between Europe and the U.S., creating an opportunity for American fashion to forge its own path. New York emerged as a new global leader, producing styles that blended practicality with a sporty, elegant aesthetic. This shift marked the beginning of America's independence in the fashion world, and it would lay the groundwork for a truly American style.
The war effort saw millions of American women take on new roles, from factory work to serving overseas. Their clothing had to adapt for function and safety, and the uniforms they wore became powerful symbols of patriotism.
The Hello Girls, women who served as telephone operators for the U.S. Army Signal Corps in France, known as the Hello Girls, wore a uniform consisting of a military-style jacket, long skirt, and garrison cap. Their uniforms were a visible statement that women were a vital part of the military machine,
even if they were not officially recognized as soldiers at the time.
The Farmerettes, members of the Woman's Land Army of America, were a civilian organization that took on agricultural work to support the war effort. Known as farmerettes, they wore practical work clothes that often included men's overalls, flannel shirts, and wide-brimmed hats, an openly practical and radical departure from typical women's dress. Even for women not in uniform, the war influenced their style. While there was no extreme rationing, patriotic campaigns encouraged women to conserve resources and embrace a simple, unadorned look. The hourglass figure of the pre-war era was replaced by a straighter, more relaxed victory silhouette. Dresses became less restrictive and more comfortable, with slightly higher waistlines. The war effectively killed the cumbersome steel-boned corset. Women's new active roles made the garment obsolete, and designers embraced looser, more natural styles that allowed for greater freedom of movement. Fashion magazines and designers promoted patriotic austerity. They encouraged women to mend and reuse old clothing and to avoid elaborate fabric-heavy styles. Colors became more subdued, with shades of gray, navy, and khaki becoming popular, subtly reflecting the military aesthetic. In conclusion, American women's fashion during World War I was a reflection of the nation's unique position. It was a story of a burgeoning fashion industry finding its own voice in a society in which women's new roles and newfound freedoms were visibly expressed through their clothing, ultimately paving the way for the liberated styles of the Roaring Twenties.